The court, I think, was wrong in Shelby County.
Voting rights is a niche political concern.
I don't have a site to vote. Therefore, how do I have a right to vote? We are still not complete people, and we deserve to be, because we are the matriarchs of the people that are here today.
Welcome to Alabama.
Welcome back to my channel. This is Stephanie, your favorite recovering lawyer, and this is Complexion of Law, a legal travel series that's going to take you along to new places while we learn about legal cases and policies that affect the Black community. For this pilot episode, we're heading to little-known Shelby County, Alabama, to discuss the 2013 Supreme Court case of Shelby v. Holder. We'll be learning how the VRA was essentially gutted and the decade's crusade to bring apathy to a voting booth near you. If you thought living through history was hard, buckle in, we have some uncovering to do.
So we're here, two Black gals.
Going to Alabama for the first time. As a lovely woman from Texas, do you consider yourself a Southerner?
I do consider myself a Southerner, but like with an asterisk.
So as a Texas asterisk Southern woman,
Yeah.
What are your initial thoughts about Alabama? Are you frightened?
I'm not necessarily frightened per se, but I mean, I just be having my wits about me. You know what I'm saying?
I've come a long way. If you asked me this question when I was in law school, I'd be like, I'm frightened. Like, why? What is the reason? Like, you would get a straight up honest Black immigrant answer out of me of like, I heard I wasn't supposed to go over there, so I'm not going. I've gotten older now, so now I'm like, that's propaganda. There's plenty of Black people in the South. I've driven through Alabama, but I've never stopped in Alabama.
When I did an interview with someone who worked at the Black Smithsonian, he mentioned this. He was like, there's actually another migration happening of the Great Migration people that came up to the north are actually coming back.
Yeah, because it's actually more communal, it's safer. I'm living in New York for 10 years. Quiet racism is still racism. We have booked 4 people to interview, so 2 in Alabama. Reverend Dukes is from Shelby County, Alabama. Corey Wilson, we're gonna interview tomorrow. He's from Alabama, went to college in Shelby County. He's a millennial, so I wanna get people of different ages. We're also interviewing a fellow attorney who's like a civil rights lawyer and an activist, and she's awesome. And surprisingly, I guess now's a great time to bring it up. This situation has taught me to dream bigger and to just ask, because what's gonna happen? Shelby v. Holder, the named defendant when you sue the Justice Department, the Department of Justice, is the current Attorney General. The holder in Shelby v. Holder is AG Eric Holder, the first Black Attorney General under Obama. He is the reason why we have gay marriage. He was a big proponent, still is, of voting rights. He's the reason why there are a lot of progressive policies that were actually passed under Obama. As the Attorney General and the leader of the Department of Justice, he was like, yeah, we gonna push this a little to the left, a little more to the left. Reverend Dukes is the first person we're interviewing, and he's like a very big community activist and organizer in the community, is the president of the NAACP in Shelby County. He's a local bus driver for the school and is a pastor, and all around like seems like a very nice, decent, wholesome man. So I'm very curious to see like how he perceives us.
I think it was 2012, I get a call, me and a few other pastors and leaders in the community, was that there's this case that's been filed in Shelby County and challenging the Voting Rights Act. We were called by the Legal Defense Fund, and we were not even aware that this was something that Shelby County was even contemplating. In order to build a case, they needed to have faces, people, local individuals. So myself and several others in the community decided to sign on, to be a part of that, to be that face representing the country against Shelby County. So we took upon ourselves also to go to these people that represent us and ask, why wasn't this something that was publicized? Why was this something that was not announced, something that you were doing?
According to a press release from the ACLU on June 22, 2010, which I partially updated for this video, in 2006, without obtaining the required federal approval, the city of Calera in Shelby County held city council elections after conducting nearly 200 annexations and redrawing its city council districts. The redistricting eliminated the only district that gave African American voters the opportunity to elect a candidate of their choice. In the subsequent elections, Councilman Ernest Montgomery, the second African American in the history of Calera to become a member of the city council, lost his seat due to the redistricting. After the changes were challenged by the U.S. Department of Justice under Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, the city of Calera was required to redo its discriminatory redistricting plan so that it would not dilute the African American vote and to conduct new elections. Under the remedial plans, Councilman Montgomery regained his seat. It should be noted that according to Reverend Dukes, during this time, there actually were 2 people serving in 2 separate seats for the 1 seat, because the city of Calera did not want to actually follow the instructions of the U.S. Department of Justice. However, later that year, Shelby County sued the Department of Justice under the guise that the Voting Rights Act was causing too much and, quote, oversight and unnecessary paperwork. Despite their documented discriminatory actions earlier that year, the county argued that the Voting Rights Act as applied to them was no longer needed. And that initial case eventually turned into the Supreme Court case of Shelby v. Holder.
We are at Yo Mama's in Birmingham. The best lunch in Birmingham. They won a few awards.
Yeah.
It's very good. It's very hot.
Yeah. I got the catfish plate. Catfish is fried beautifully. Seasoning, delicious. I also got a side of grits because I just really wanted to try the grits. They're creamy, they're buttery, they're everything my heart desires.
Ditto. Cheesy grits. I put some hot sauce in them. And then I got the shrimp plate. Very good. We stop here before we go to the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute.
But yeah, we're heading over there to interview someone, a local politician.
He ran for state senate, also millennial.
Yeah.
And particularly to talk about how the effects of Shelby v. Holder have affected Alabama, and then of course like the broader nation.
I'm a born and raised Alabamian, and I was born in Huntsville. My mom is from Birmingham, and my dad is from Wilcox County, Camden.
And as an Alabamian, do you have feelings about people's preconceived feelings about said Alabama?
2 of the biggest stereotypes about the South are that the people are incredibly uneducated. And then the second one is that it is incredibly segregated in a way that is unique to the South. The myth sort of is that, you got Jim Crow after the Civil War and all that other stuff, and the northern states were perfect sort of paradises or enclaves for Black people as they were seeking their freedom. And that is not true. I don't think that the South has a unique issue with those things compared to the rest of the nation.
I agree. And having lived in New York now for 10 years, when I first moved, my first thought was wow, this is the most segregated place I've ever lived.
And I'll tell you, Shelby County is very sleepy. Honestly, at that time, I think if you would ask most residents of Shelby County about the case, they might not have even known that it was happening. Shelby Holder was brought to my attention through National Public Radio. It was this huge national discourse because the court was going to did rule on preclearance and other sections of the Voting Rights Act.
Preclearance is the process defined in Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act that required states and certain local governments with a history of racially discriminatory voting practices to submit any changes in their election laws, policies, or electoral district maps to the Department of Justice for advance review before said changes were allowed to go into effect.
But even today, I don't think that Shelby v. Holder is in people's minds as much as it should be.
Hey, how are you? Definitely nice to see you.
So, you're the Holder in Shelby v. Holder.
Yeah, but see, we don't call it Shelby County versus Holder case. That pisses me off.
Ooh.
I don't want my name associated with what I think is one of the worst Supreme Court decisions of all time. So if you want to be my friend, you just call it the Shelby County case. I remember hearing about the challenge in Shelby County, and it was basically a challenge to a thing that was called the coverage formula within the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which essentially said that certain states that had a history of discrimination when it came to voting were covered by the act. And in order to make changes in the electoral process in those covered states, you had to get approval from the Justice Department. The Shelby County case challenged that.
The Voting Rights Act of 1965 finally granted full citizenship to Black Americans with the right to vote. Under the Voting Rights Act, Black Americans no longer face poll taxes, violence, or any other hindrances. However, on June 25th, 2013, that Voting Rights Act was essentially gutted by the Shelby v. Holder case.
When I first heard about it, I thought, well, I kind of dismissed it because Congress, in reenacting the Voting Rights Act of 1965, had, I think, unanimously in the Senate, maybe 4 or 5 people in the House of Representatives voted not to reauthorize it out of 435. President George W. Bush signed the reauthorization. They had done extensive hearings. There were hundreds of pages of testimony, thousands of exhibits. And I thought, well, the case for the continuation of the statute had been made by Congress. And I thought the Supreme Court would look at what Congress had done and said, well, it's fine. We'll, based on the record that's before us, we will allow the statute to be reauthorized. And instead, in a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court said that very important power that the Justice Department had was going to be taken away from the Justice Department. And therefore, those covered states were no longer covered, and they could make electoral changes without the approval of the Justice Department. And that's had a really negative impact on our voting system in the country since that case was decided back in 2013.
In Shelby v. Holder, not only did the Supreme Court take away the powers of Congress by deciding that the Voting Rights Act was no longer needed, Shelby v. Holder essentially stated that states who had a known history of racism, were no longer that racist. Essentially, Shelby v. Holder gutted Section 4B of the Voting Rights Act. Section 4B was designed to put in place a formula for certain states that had a known history of discriminating against Black Americans. Under Section 4B, those states with documented racist histories had to get federal oversight in order to change their voting laws. Now, without Section 4B, Section 5, which monitored these states, was essentially rendered inoperable. And of course, like people who need consequences, without any consequences in place, those same states under Shelby v. Holder immediately reverted back to their deplorable behavior.
We had a lot of outside influence. The South, they like to say we had some Yankees. This gentleman by the name of Blum, he thought this was the perfect situation to file a case where it can go to the Supreme Court to challenge the Voting Rights Act. And so he came to the county commission privately. Nobody knew about it. It wasn't publicized. And he met with them and he told them that he would finance it. He would pay for all legal fees if they would file the case.
For context, he was not a citizen of Shelby County never has been.
Never lived in Alabama.
Wow.
And so they agreed at a unannounced county commission meeting that none of us were present. They decided to vote to file the case. And so their local attorney filed the case. And that's when we basically were made aware of what potentially became the Shelby v. Holder case.
Let's take a step back to how this case even came to be.
As you probably heard me audibly gasp and the sheer irritation come out of my voice at Reverend Duke mentioning Edward Blum, that is because Edward Blum is a nefarious boogeyman come to life. It should be noted that although Edward Blum popped his happy behind for no reason into Shelby County's business by popping up at the courthouse and then convincing Shelby County to help dismantle the Voting Rights Act, Edward Blum is not now, nor has he ever been, a lawyer. He's simply a man of great means and dubious funding. Truly, where did he get that money? And even with all of that money, he couldn't win his congressional race in Houston, Texas, circa 1992. Since that 1992 loss and following his 1994 lawsuit stemming from his congressional loss, the non-lawyer has dedicated his life to dismantling any racial equity laws or policies. He would go on to handpick and sponsor numerous court cases and policies that on their face were designed to provide racial equity to the Black community. From Shelby v. Holder to propping up his goddaughter Abigail Fisher to be the face of lackluster grades everywhere, Edward Blum is determined to attack any of what he calls race-based policies, aka policies that again are designed to make America a more equitable place. Simply put, Edward Blum is the boogeyman behind the scenes, and it's time his ugly mug see the light of day.
The biggest concern I had was that the court was substituting its judgment for the judgment of Congress. And Congress had done extensive amounts of work to show that there was still a need for the Voting Rights Act as it was constituted to continue. The court kind of ignored all of that and decided that it wanted to do away with that very important component of the act. When the people who were arguing the case against us made those kinds of arguments, I thought they were kind of ridiculous, given, again, the factual findings that Congress had made. And yet the Solicitor General at the time, a guy named Don Borelli, extremely good lawyer, said that he was worried about the case. And I remember telling him, no, I don't think so, Don. That would be a real big leap for this court to, in essence, overrule Congress. But as time passed, I became more and more convinced that the possibility existed that the court might do what it ultimately did do. And it was a 5-4 decision, as narrow as it can get. Chief Justice Roberts wrote for the Supreme Court and said that America has changed. And there's no question about that. America has changed. But the question really is, has America changed enough? And I think the answer to that was no.
Once we start hearing the oral arguments and we're listening to the justices come back with the rhetoric, then it kind of starts in your mind. They've already made their decision. So you're kind of thinking that, wow, okay, it could go either way. So you're sitting on pins and needles.
There's one thing that I'll give Chief Justice Roberts, is that I do think that the way that preclearance in Section 2 was crafted, that states with a history of like racism and voter suppression only being the states that had to undergo preclearance is discriminatory against those states. I think he's absolutely correct on that. I think that the Voting Rights Act should apply to all the states the entire time. No state should be able to change their electoral system or pass a law to change the electoral system without the feds okaying it first, without the Department of Justice specifically okaying it first. Do I think that that was a good reason to like get rid of those tools? No. Literally the day after Shelby v. Holder was decided, that's when you get like all the voter ID laws and voter suppression laws.
After speaking with Corey, we went back to Atlanta to talk to Aklima Klondikar, a lawyer working with the Carter Center to combat the voter suppression laws happening not only in the state of Georgia, but across the country.
A lot of times when we think about issues surrounding the Voting Rights Act, we think about litigation, right? You file a lawsuit, you wait for that lawsuit to give you an injunction of some kind or whatever relief you're looking for so that you can properly protect your constituents or the people, your clients, the people you're representing. The reality is the Voting Rights Act is a tool for litigation, but all of the issues that surround our elections and voting have a policy component and have a community engagement component. Now, people who don't have the right to vote because, let's say, there's no site to vote because their polling location was closed, they can't wait around for litigation to find itself so that all of a sudden a solution comes and they have that right. That can take many years. The wheels of litigation move very slowly. So with the community component and the policy component, that means that now a lawyer can listen to the needs of the community more directly. Perhaps if your polling site was closed because the Shelby v. Holder decision meant that we had over 200 polling sites closed across the state of Georgia. Perhaps what we could do instead is have 20% of signatures within this particular district petition your state election board to keep your site open. That is something that you can do. That is a provision of local law that is not directly tied to the VRA, but could mean an immediate result to the people who need it the most.
In a very good dissenting opinion, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg had a really good analogy, I thought. She said, if you're in a thunderstorm, and you've got an umbrella over your head. That's the Voting Rights Act, right? And you're not getting wet. In the middle of a thunderstorm, you don't say, well, gee, I can take down my umbrella now because I'm not getting wet. You take it down, what happens? You get wet. And so what the court did was to take down that umbrella, which was protection against attempts to make it more difficult for certain people to vote. And what's happened? A whole bunch of people have gotten wet and find it more difficult, to vote.
I think it was in 2015 when Governor Robert Bentley was still the governor of Alabama. In 31 counties where there was majority black residency, he shut down the DMVs, right? So it's like, okay, you need an ID to vote, but we're gonna make sure that getting a driver's license is really, really hard. Now, he eventually had to walk that back, but his walk back was like, okay, we'll leave them open for one day out of the week.
Justice Roberts, as a 28-year-old law clerk, was the law clerk behind Mobile v. Bowdoin. 24 years, he connived and planned to chip away at voting rights.
We have multiple articles written about
written about him. And now him, as well as Justice Clarence Thomas, Alito, multiple of them have been under question about corruption and whether or not the Supreme Court needs to be curtailed because these people have unfettered access and power, which they have consolidated. So I think when you look at it in the context of these things, the rights that we took so many decades to get and had to fight for can be undone in so many decades of quiet evil work.
When I've read some of the articles, some of the things that Chief Justice Roberts has said about Shelby v. Holder specifically, there is a path you can trace, a through line to him believing that the Voting Rights Act, which was an incredibly successful piece of policy, was a piece of policy that he hated and wanted to get rid of. But even sort of knowing people's political agendas, it's not disqualifying them, obviously, from being confirmed to the Supreme Court.
It is time for our legislators to take action to provide additional guidelines for those who continue to try and disenfranchise our vote, our right to vote.
But when it comes to the legal aspect of it, and the biggest strength was, to me, they ignored facts. And they just went based off of the same old thing they used to do back in the day. You know, when there would be a tragedy or when a police officer would murder someone or just a Ku Klux Klan would kill someone, they go to court and they find them not guilty. But that's what we were looking at during that Shelby Holder case. We were looking at that type of justice take place. The same thing we saw years and years ago, you know, and it was just like, wow, what do we do now? And we've been struggling with that for the last 11 years about what do we do now?
In hindsight, what do you think the DOJ, or what do you wish the DOJ had done a little bit differently?
I'm not sure we could have done anything differently. I mean, I think that Congress had, produced a good record. I think the briefs that we filed were really good. I know the argument that was done by the Solicitor General was a good one. I think, this one was cooked. This ideological court simply decided that they didn't like the Voting Rights Act. And as a result of that dislike of the act, they ignored facts. They ignored the reality that still exists in this country. Even though America, has changed, they decided the case in the way in which they wanted. I think that is among the worst decisions that the Supreme Court has ever made. And if you look at a trio of cases, you look at the Citizens United case, which allows untold amounts of money into our system, the Shelby County case, which really cripples the Voting Rights Act, the Rucho case, which said you can't bring partisan gerrymandering cases into the federal courts. That trio of voting rights cases, I think, is in some ways going to be the legacy of the Roberts Court, and shows that that court was not protective of the thing that is most central to our democracy. That's the right to vote. They did not do that which other courts have done, which is to protect people's hard-won right to vote.
And currently now that the court under Justice Roberts has gone in such an ideological way, and we're seeing that now with current cases like affirmative action, Roe v. Wade, etc., what do you
Dobbs.
What are ways that you think the current DOJ can help fight against that?
Well, I think the Justice Department still has to be as vigorous as it can be in the defense of Voting Rights Act. There are still parts of the Voting Rights Act that exist, Section 2, which is really important and which we have used at the National Democratic Redistricting Committee, where I'm the chair. We've used Section 2 to bring successful cases, one in Alabama. Under Section 2, the courts have found that the state legislature did there was a racial gerrymander. Should have had an additional black opportunity district so that you could elect another black congressman from Alabama. We won that case. And then surprisingly, this same Supreme Court decided that Section 2 was valid. The case that we brought in Alabama was valid, and said that what the Alabama legislature had done was incorrect. So in Alabama, there will be, in November of this year, the opportunity to elect another black congressman. I think Shamari figures he's going to win. Same thing is going to happen in Louisiana. We're going to see the impact of that win also in Florida, in Texas. We've seen it in Georgia as well. So The court, I think, was wrong in Shelby County. I think it was right in the Harper versus Milligan case, which said that Section 2 is still a vibrant and vital part of the act.
This is our 11th time to be gathering, and we're going to continue to gather until we have a new Voting Rights Act. We're going to continue to gather until everybody can vote without being disenfranchised or without being discouraged or in any shape, form, or fashion. I'm Reverend Dukes. I'm the first vice chair for Shelby County, third vice chair for the state conference, and we're just looking forward to this weekend and celebrating, amen, what the right to vote, celebrating this prestigious honor to vote.
It's our job to give them the history and the why and allow them to adjust and to see, not based off what happened in the 50s and the 60s, but based off what's happening right now. I think we can do that, and I think we've failed. And when I say we, I'm talking about my generation. I think we failed to tell the story and then having the expectation of thinking that you're just going to jump in because of what happened, to Rosa Parks or what happened with Dr. King. They are great examples. They are pillars of what they did for their generation. There's a hymn in the church called A Charge to Keep I Have, and a part of that hymn says, to serve this present age is my calling to fulfill.
One of the reasons why I wanted to interview you, because your community activism, but also as a somewhat I'm trudging along, I'm trying to push back millennial, I thought it was very admirable that you ran for state senate in Alabama. And so speaking of local politics, so I wanted to get into that. What prompted you to be like, you know what, I've been here my whole life, I don't like this, I'm not dealing with this, and I'm gonna try it out?
I ran because for a while now is that there have been too many uncontested races.
I didn't know that.
A lot of races in Alabama go uncontested, meaning that a Republican will get on the ballot, right? They'll pay their dues to Secretary of State's office, or they'll get the signatures needed to get their name on the ballot, and there will be no Democratic opposition to them at all. And so when I talk about sort of my state suffering under a political monopoly, we have trifecta government, right? They have a supermajority in the House and the Senate, and our governor is a Republican. There was an election coming up. They didn't have somebody who was going to contest the race. I agreed to contest. And for it being my first time running for office with no name recognition and 3% of the total amount of funds that my opponent had, getting 37% of the vote didn't feel bad.
That's amazing, honestly. Because that's very high, proportionally to the amount that he paid.
So he had $300,000. Mm-hmm. I raised about $12,000, mm-hmm. and he did spend over $100,000 in the end to thwart me, I guess.
Voting is often touted as the only way everyday people can make a difference in our government, but it's much more accurate to look at voting as simply one low-lift way to get involved. You can, like Corey, run for office, whether that be a school board seat or a state senator. There are a myriad of creative ways to get involved from behind the scenes, especially if you're a lawyer. From organizing others to help pass bills that benefit the community to educating that same community of the rights granted to us, you'd be surprised how collectively we can push things forward.
I think for a lot of people who enter the law, it's very black and white. You end up being placed in a box and you're told, it's really drilled in you throughout your entire time in law school that you have to be this particular way. I once had a professor before entering law school say to me, don't go into the law, you have too much color. And I didn't understand what that meant until I actually went into the practice that, everybody wants me to think a different way. And for me, I wanted to think the community way because that's the way that matters. So for me, as a community/movement lawyer, it means that I'm thinking about the needs of the community first. I'm trying to meet them where they are, and litigation is not always my answer. Litigation is, to me, another tool that we can use, but it's a long-term, long-game thing. It's not the only way. I do things like know your rights training. So for example, with election protection, everybody understands it as 866 our vote. That's the hotline that people call in whenever there's an issue related to accessing the ballot on election day. What folks may not know is that a cadre of lawyers and law students often come to the state of Georgia to support its election protection efforts. So I have provided training on new provisions of law, what you need to know about SB 202, things like restrictions on bottles of water and snacks while you're waiting in line. How do you get around it?
Led by the Georgia Republican-controlled state Senate and Governor Brian Kemp, Georgia passed Georgia Senate Bill 202, a sweeping 98-page legislation that cuts the period during which voters may request an absentee ballot from nearly 6 months before an election to less than 3, makes it a misdemeanor to provide food or water to voters in line.
Just hearing that restriction is prohibitive for a lot of people, but folks may not know that you actually can engage in that activity if you are 150 feet away from the outer edge of the voting site. Now, that's difficult to determine in some instances, but we can give some quick tips on how to do that. And those are the sort of things that I do for lawyers and law students entering into the space. So we have the Voting Rights Act of 1965 specifically to ensure that people do not have those restrictions. No more literacy tests, no more poll taxes, no more making it difficult for people, specifically people of color, to access the ballot. That means allowing people free access to the franchise. However, that is not our reality, right? People have now found new and inventive ways to keep people from accessing the franchise. We have been fighting for freedom since the first ship came here with slaves. We have never stopped fighting for that freedom. So though the pictures in 1965 to now look different, the sentiments are the same. You see Black folks that are standing in long lines, particularly in Georgia, 8, 10 hours to vote. Why? I don't have a site to vote. Therefore, how do I have a right to vote, right? You have criminal disenfranchisement that is widely over impacts people of color, particularly in the state of Georgia. Because the state of Georgia, okay, I completed my felony conviction, but I'm still on probation. Can I vote? No. I'm on parole. Can I vote? No. I'm still paying fines and fees tied to this felony conviction. Can I vote? No. If a state like Maine, predominantly white, can you vote in jail? Yes, you can. So let's think about that when we're considering, the Voting Rights Act solved everything. It's just voter restrictions and racism by another name. That's where we're at now.
With the apathy that has now seemingly taken root in people, not gonna lie, I'm very irritated. What do you think is some of the ways that maybe we can combat that apathy? Because you have been doing community activism for so long.
A lot of the voter apathy and irritation is warranted. It is a reasonable reaction to not getting the political goals, political accomplishments that the candidates who you voted for during a pandemic, all this other stuff, we often take for granted, how much work has been put into the system before we got here. And that while doing the work is continually draining, there are, in my view, 2, maybe 3 outcomes, right? People stop doing the work and we go into sort of full-on authoritarian government. People keep doing the work and we push past our current barriers and get to where, the place we say we want to be without trying to use sort of the sacrifices of people in the past as a cudgel against voters today. We're so close. Mm-hmm. We're very, very close. And I think that a lot of some of the worst tendencies of American politicians, regardless of political orientation, regardless of political party that we see, is an extinction burst. An extinction burst is a psychological term where before behavior changes in an individual, you will typically see worsening of that behavior before it goes away permanently. And so when we're looking at a society that is trying to claw back all of these rights, it seems like the last grasp of desperate people trying to entrench their power because they know that their time of rule is coming to an end. And so if my ancestors can work tirelessly for their lifetimes in order to improve things to the way where they got comfortable enough, to pass the torch, then I feel like it behooves me to keep doing that until I get where I want to go or I die trying.
In your book, Our Unfinished March, you state our country moves forward and backwards. We grant rights and then take them away. If you don't hold on to the progress you've made, if you don't remain vigilant in defending it, it will be reversed.
Progress is not promised. It's something that you have to fight for. Victories are not certain. You have to fight to make sure that that which was won yesterday remains in place today and will be there, in the future.
Also in your book, you dedicate about a third towards a plan of like, hey, this is the action plan we need to do. This is how we need to move forward to secure voting rights for everyone. Could you briefly summarize that for people who should and will hopefully read the book after this?
Yeah, I come up with a number of specific measures. With regard to the Supreme Court, I think we should have term limits. I think members of the court should serve about 18 years. And I think that's enough. We have people now who serve 30 and 40 years and who get a little disconnected from the people they're supposed to serve. And so I think, as I said, 18-year terms. I also think that with regard to the Supreme Court, a president should appoint a new justice in his or her first year and his or her third year of the term. So every president would appoint 2 justices per term. That would expand the court in the short term, but over time, and with 18-year terms, the court would contract back to 9 members. I think we should outlaw partisan and racial gerrymandering. We have the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Bill that would have done that before. I think if that is introduced again, that should be passed. We should have guaranteed number of early voting days around the country. I think that we should make Election Day a holiday, so that people don't have to choose between going to work and casting a ballot. You have to ask yourself, why do we vote on a Tuesday? And it has to do with bringing crops to market and all that stuff. I'm not sure, but have you brought crops to market any in the recent past? I have not. I haven't done that either. So, if you don't make it a national holiday, why not make Election Day a Saturday? Do away with the filibuster. Do away with the filibuster in the Senate, which has allowed a minority of senators representing a very small minority in the country to block legislation that is really universally supported. So those are some of the kinds of things that I think we should do, that I think we can do to perfect our democracy.
I think that a diversity of backgrounds, a diversity of professional backgrounds could also be helpful, because oftentimes, even now, the Supreme Court doesn't fully understand the scope of the rulings that they're deciding when it comes to the tech sector and things like that.
Net neutrality is a great example. I'm convinced that they don't know what that means. I'm convinced.
But what I will say, Malcolm X says we're not outnumbered, we're just out-organized. When you look at how well organized the right is, whether it's Project Red Map, the Heritage Foundation, the Federalist Society, all the work they did, right, to groom people like Kyle Rittenhouse to be public figures. And someday somebody might ask Kyle Rittenhouse to run for office. I don't know, right? But they're very well organized. And so we have to get better organized. And if we're talking about it not from the Democratic Party needs to get better organized, but people who have concerns and are looking to push the country toward a more just and robust systems, then those people have to get organized, and then you have to learn how to play the game of running for office. Running for office is not as hard as people think.
I think that first off, you got to be optimistic. Pessimism breeds inaction. Optimism, I think, brings about involvement. And as bad as things might seem today, you have to know history. And think about the young people in the civil rights movement in the 50s and the 60s. A young Dr. Martin Luther King, a young John Lewis, a young Diane Nash. People who really brought down a system of American apartheid. Now, and this has been entrenched in the United States for 100 years. Slavery 240 years before that. Those young people didn't say, well, we can't change things. They didn't accept the status quo. What they did was to organize, to fight, to go to jail. They sacrificed, they committed themselves. Some people lost their lives. And what did they do? Destroyed apartheid, set up the civil rights movement that really changed this nation.
One of the things Halise and I talked about was how in the US that unfortunately the majority of the people from the civil rights movement, we have martyrs, but we also have John Lewis, and we recently learned about Reverend Shuttlesworth in Alabama. The airport is named after him, and he fought
against bombings, against Jim Crow, all of that. And so in interviewing people in Shelby County in Alabama, one of the things, and I'll read the quote from Reverend Dukes, that he said is Alabama has the keys to voting rights for this country, and they've had at its inception, and they've not been a good steward with those keys. I don't think they need to have them. I think somebody else needs to take keys to voting rights from the state of Alabama. As a country, how can we better recognize Alabama and all the work that people in Alabama have done, which I think is kind of overlooked?
Yeah, Alabama has a special place in my heart. I'm married to a woman who was born in Mobile, Alabama, and her sister, Vivian Malone, was the young woman who in 1963 integrated the University of Alabama when George Wallace stood in the schoolhouse door, marched in there with the help of the Justice Department, integrated the University of Alabama, was the first black graduate of the University of Alabama, and that was my wife's sister. She died, way too young, but that commitment, that courage, again, that sacrifice is something that has inspired me. And Alabama, I think, holds a special, an unfortunate place in our history, where black people's rights were not honored, where voting rights were diluted, where voting rights were taken away. And so, yeah, there is some truth to the notion that the keys do exist in Alabama. But I think the keys actually are now held and being misused, not only in the South, but also in other states, in Ohio, Wisconsin, Michigan, where we brought a number of lawsuits and done a number of other things and have actually taken the keys away from people who want to do inappropriate things. That gerrymander is going to be broken up in the election that happens this November. Michigan, that gerrymander has already been broken up. So I think that we can look at the South and still be concerned about it, Alabama, other states, but we have to really look at it nationwide to make sure that the people who hold the keys to our democracy are people who are intent on making sure that every person has the right to vote.
We're here in Shelby County.
In front of the original courthouse.
I love me a good town square. We're actually in the town square.
We are,
So
quite literally.
when you learn about everything about Alabama, Shelby specifically, you come to the place and you're like, fire and brimstone. But at the end of the day, it is at its core a small town with people that are just going about living their lives. And like many of us are apathetic. Like a lot of Shelby County residents didn't realize what was happening right underneath them.
And it's what happens while you have the apathy that I think is the scariest part.
Yeah.
Because I think from observation and talking to a lot of the residents, there were a select group of people who were immediately outraged, went to Shelby County versus Holder oral arguments in DC, so at the Supreme Court. And then there were other people who were like, well, I didn't make the decision, what's going on? And then now here we are, where they're clawing away at rights. And so what is, people always say, it's not the bad actors that do the most harm, it's people just being like, well, it's the shrugging. Because as long as you have enough people that shrug, then the foolishness will go on, unchecked.
But then you come to a place like Alabama, it feels way more significant and relevant because of everything that happened in Mobile, everything that happened in Montgomery, everything that happened here and in Birmingham as well. We were walking through the BCIR and there were pictures of the young protesters, sit-ins, etc., freedom riders, all of that kind of stuff. And one of them, I thought to myself, wow, he looks like he could be my cousin. And then I read his name and he had my mother's maiden name. And I was like, he actually genuinely might be my cousin. I think Alabama is fascinating because it provides the pilgrimage aspect that I think a lot of Black Americans don't have when they think about going to a place like DC.
My apathy is rooted in the fact of what happens when we did all the things that they said to do and then we don't get the things we were promised. And I think in terms of my apathy in doing this project and coming to Alabama, it has something that I would say is very hard to ignore and that I'm glad we got to witness was people actually doing the work and being like, listen, I'm not just going to sit here and take it.
Yeah.
And I think that has given me a sense of hopefulness Because when you're apathetic and then everyone else around you looks apathetic, you're like, oh my, like what is gonna happen? Yeah. And then depending on your relationship with violence, what happens after you burn it down though? You still need institutions, people still need care, we still need schools. Somebody help the kids, child. Yeah. Somebody help the children. Down with Jay-Z and those vouchers. And that has given me a sense of like, oh no, these are not only valid questions, but I feel more hopeful and less hopeless in that, oh yeah, we deserve to live a good life. We deserve to have these unalienable rights that allegedly we were promised. Right. So, all right, if we have to, bring awareness to the situation and find some hopefulness, I'm all for that.
Yeah, it's bringing proof to power of like, you can't be apathetic because even if
you can't complain and then also be like and do nothing and then not do anything and then be like it's not working. Well, it's like, well, I was sitting here, so well, yes.
I guess the other thing is like, what are you waiting for? You're waiting for somebody to give it to you, and it's never been given.
No,
it's always been given.
No.
It was also really interesting being here in Alabama and learning about just other people besides the martyrs that we've come to know. But seeing someone like a Reverend Shuttlesworth gave me a lot more hope of someone who actually lived through a time, fought for it, and then got to live in the benefits of it. Like well into his 80s, got to live a full and complete life. Don't get me wrong, I am more than happy to fight the good fight for the next generation so that they can have a better life too. But I would love to reap some of the benefits of it as well.
Which is right. Like, I would like a little something.
I would
like Denzel said, I'm leaving with something.
I'm leaving here with something.
I don't think the country understood that this wasn't just a Shelby County, Alabama thing. This is something that brings a nation together. And I've always felt, being a citizen in Shelby County, that if Shelby County thought, yeah, we will bring this case, then I think the entire country should come to Shelby County, Alabama. And I think the entire country should say, if this is the epicenter of this political and social earthquake, then we need to give you the attention you ask for. I think we need to come and show how we feel, basically, about what's happened to our voting rights, what's happening with the political climate and culture in this country. I think it all started with the case of Shelby v. Holder. And I don't think the nation has responded as one. I think we've hit little pockets and we see certain things, and then you don't really deal with it until the next election. You talk about it and they, the little pockets. And I think, why can't we take a day, one day out of a year, and you go and you say, if this is where it started, this is where we have to defeat it. I really think we have to bring the United States to Alabama. We gained voting rights, was basically established after a bloody Sunday in Selma. And here we are, 60 miles north, some 60 years later, in Shelby County, Alabama, we lose what we gain. Alabama has the keys to voting rights for this country, and they've been had it from its inception, and they've not been a good steward with those keys. They come to Selma and they react Selma. They cross them and Pettus Bridge, and they do it every year, and I think they should because of what happened and what we got from that. But when are we going to start doing, when is Shelby going to become the new Selma? We have to. And so we started it, and we've been doing it now for 11 years, and we're going to continue until we get change. We're going to continue until we get a new Voting Rights Act, and then we're probably going to continue from that point because it's history. And a history forgotten is often repeated. And so that's really what I want to happen. If you had to ask me what I want to happen from this case, I think we need to give Shelby County what they thought they wanted, attention.
Simply put, Edward Plum... I've been up since 3:30.